But let us pause here. There are many portraits of Joan as valiant martyr, as feminist icon, as courageous mystic, as someone who has studied and loved Joan for many years. I want to plant her back in her context, and her humanity and her complexity. I do not think it buys us anything to fetishize her heroism or her tragic death. Rather, she may offer more to us if we look at her compassionately as someone caught in a socio-religious political storm, making both good and bad decisions simultaneously, who died too young and who has been simplified and co-opted by nationalist and religious movements since then. Let us peer through the cracks in her armor to the living, breathing being. First, it is worth naming the roles she did genuinely occupy during her brief 15th century life. She was a social radical, an enemy of the state, even if she did not self-conceptualize as one. And Joan was a true medieval mystic, informed by a rich inheritance of ecstatic visionaries and prophets who had normalized their involvement in ecclesiastical and monarchical affairs in the preceding centuries. Kings and queens often called on visionaries for political advice. This strain of spiritual individualism, directly inspired by a dialogue with God, although initially sanctioned by the church when it safely occurred in convents, was quickly becoming a dangerous vocation. Christianity, post-plague, informed by the rise of literacy, was increasingly defined by stable intellectual categories, dogma and canon law, and a well-defined liturgy available only to a male priesthood. The individual revelation classical of female mystics was seen as a direct threat to the order of the church militant. And it didn't help that women, exiled from academic faith, often located their spiritual experiences in the body's ecstasies and agonies. By the 1400s, the church was actively working to suppress female mystics and wise women. The Beguine movement, an order of lay women who practiced miraculous cures, levitation, and mystical meditation outside of ecclesiastical male supervision, were officially outlawed by Pope Clement V in 1311. It is also important to note that most of these women did not self-identify as witches. Rather, they truly believed they were Christians, accessing the divine without the meddling of a priesthood that was, by the lower classes, often seen as overly preoccupied with money and rules. Prior to Joan's life, Marguerite Porete, another French female mystic who received visions of Jesus, was executed in 1310, and her trial set the template for how Joan would also be misinterpreted and framed as heterodox. Like Joan, Marguerite's testimony was lifted out of context and pasted together to produce a heretical portrait that was then sent to a theological commission. Marguerite was incorrectly portrayed as saying that nature could grant her all that she asked. This statement was radical and alarming to church authorities for several different reasons. One, it implied a pre-Christian Celtic affinity for working with elements and commanding them through magical means. Two, it implied that there was no need for the mediation of a priesthood or the sacraments, as the divine was already freely available in the natural world. This was a conscious misrepresentation of Porete, who did not oppose what she called the church at the little, but instead stressed the greater importance of spiritual self-sufficiency. By the time Joan was born, proclaiming individual revelation was very risky. But there was still some safety in the strain of mysticism that inspired a monastic retreat from society. Many mystics from the Middle Ages are characterized by ecstatic inaction. Yes, they were visionary, but they rarely let those visions manifest as political or social activity. While Joan's visions overlap with those of Porete, Hildegard de Bingen, Marjorie Kemp, and the Beguine laywomen, her response to these visions diverged dramatically from the norm. The question that is most interesting to me is not the legitimacy of Joan's mystical experiences, but why or how her visions focused on the crisis in the French monarchy. The 100-Year War, alongside the plague, famine, and social strife, had left both the nobility and the peasantry cynical about France's future. The Dauphin, the king who had not yet been crowned, his plight and the question of his illegitimacy were well known, but he did not have outspoken support from either the noblemen or the peasants. There was a collective fatigue following the loss of the battle at Agincourt and the peasantry were hard-pressed and overtaxed on both sides of the conflict. Both armies looted their land, and outlaws terrorized them. This war-ragged reality was not conceptual to Joan, and neither was it biased towards France, which makes her own decision to cleave to the disgraced Dauphin compelling. She knew that her town had been largely unprotected by French forces, and she knew several people who had died in the conflict. Her own cousin by marriage had been shot down in front of the village church of Surmaise. In 1419, an outlaw squire had captured 33 men from just outside her town, and Joan's father and his friends were forced to sign an agreement with the outlaw in exchange for safety. And in 1428, by the time Joan had decided to claim her role, Valcouleur, just 19 kilometers north of Domremy, was under attack by Anglo-Burgundian forces. Shortly after, her own town was raided, and she was forced to evacuate with her family to Neufchâteau. And when they returned, their town had been entirely burned to the ground. But the real question is, what is it that dilated Joan's natural worry about civil unrest and violence into an epic and heroic vision of military redemption through her individual intervention? We can interrupt a saccharine image of Joan as a beatific martyr bent on saving her country when we realize that she was a canny young woman who grew up in a culture that put great stake in prophecy. Part of the reason why she was so readily accepted by Charles, by the nobility, and by the French army was because there was a prophetic tradition stretching back 500 years to Bede, to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Merlin, to St. Euclid, and then re-articulated by the contemporary mystic Marie Robin, that a maid would come from Lorraine to save France. Visionary states are often abstract. They reject easy interpretation. Joan herself struggled to explain her mysticism when pressed to vocalize the experience on trial. It is interesting to imagine a young Joan in her father's garden in the summer of 1424, receiving what she would later describe as a great light and points of light, planting this ineffable experience in the contextual soil of folkloric prophecies. Was she initially prompted to save France, or did she readily interpret the mystical intervention as a divine sign that she was the maid in question? We hear by her own words in her trial that her father too had prophetic dreams, and that many times he had dreamed that she took off with men at arms. For him, this could only mean Joan was a traveling prostitute. He couldn't see the other much wilder possibility, that she would be leading those men at arms. And this leads to one of the first, as I'm calling them, cracks in the armor of the fetishized maid. Joan was powerful, not because she was chosen by God, but because she actively chose her own fate, for better and for worse. Mysticism, when it is represented in the world of language and the world of symbolic action, always requires translation. It is always flavored and biased by the instrument from which it emanates. Joan, when her visionary strings were plucked, chose to play the song of militaristic victory. And we honor her not by making her a divine vessel, but by understanding her own entanglement with the socio-political context of her time. As anthropologist I.M. Lewis states, mystical experience, like any other experience, is grounded in and must relate to the social environment in which it is achieved. It thus invariably bears the stamp of the culture in which it arises. I would also add that it bears the stamp of the individual and bodily ecosystem it chooses as its mouthpiece. When we give Joan her agency to choose back, she shakes loose the docility of the saint, the tragic romance of the martyr, the dour stricture of divine vessel, and steps onto the morally shaky ground of rebellious visionary. Joan made choices, and those choices were morally complex. While no one came to save Joan in July of 1431, we can save her now from bad stories that gloss over the pain and complexity of her human experience. We can honor the texture and tenacity of her life instead of her death. There will be no savior for any one of us, no personal salvation. No single person or species is going to make it alone. We need a council of beings. No one is coming to save us, but everyone is coming to save everyone.
So we're talking today about witches as enemies of the state. And I wanted to get into what the state is a little bit, because I think most of us have this idea of what it is, and we kind of know, like, oh, the state is our government, but I want to get a little bit more nitty-gritty about this today. So one of the things that we can recognize as being of the state is this drive to or impulse towards simplification, abstraction, and standardization. So states are always going to try and reduce complexity and take particulars such as like the water table here in Yangna, Los Angeles, and how it's operating, and turn it into something that is governable and conforms to national standards by putting it in a cement waterway, for instance. And the reason that it does things like this is so that it can monitor, count, assess, and manage natural resources. States are directly tied to the extraction of wealth, abundance, elements, and other resources from the land. They also always seek to observe, regulate, and tax the population. That's why they exist. That's why they're doing all of this stuff. And so some of the ways that they work some of the strategies that they use to do this homogenizing process on people are imposing common languages. So, for instance, in the UK, there were hundreds of different languages only a couple thousand years ago, even amongst people who were maybe only 20 miles apart from one another. And then as England was colonized by the Romans, and then the Holy Roman Empire, and then the feudal lords who were seeking to kind of bring them all together and impose a government, then they made it so that English was the national language. And now English is like, because of the colonization, is now maybe an international language. So they're also going to do the same practice with religions, with currencies, with legal systems, because the primary impulse of the state is to be able to manage from the center, right? Not managed by the particularities of whatever is going on specifically in that land and in that place, among those people, among those animals, among those waters, mountains, plants. Instead, the impulse of the state is to manage from an external place where they're going to impose laws. So it's rule through text, through like constitutions, which are documents. They're not actual living things. They're frozen, for instance. We're experiencing this a lot in my country right now, where there's a battle for abortion rights, and the Supreme Court is arguing that we have to stick to what was intended in the original framing of the Constitution several hundred years ago. And this is important. It's really important to understand this concept as we enter into what witchcraft is all about, or how witchcraft has been framed in our culture, because the inquisitions against witches, which I will argue essentially created what we really understand now as witchcraft, started when the state really started to shift from the spiritual powers in the world to political powers of government. So let me just gather my thoughts here. So one of the projects of the state then is this utopian vision of what things will be like rather than what they actually are. And it it has a continually frustrated goal to reduce the chaotic, disorderly, constantly changing social, and I would argue physical reality beneath the state, what we might call the undercommons. Fred Moten might call the undercommons, that which is underneath what the state is imposing, trying to reduce that into something like an administrative grid. And that has been really the constant project for several hundred years. Another important thing in witchcraft, there are no spectators, there's no witness. Now, in our culture, the state is the witness, right? The state is the one that's pointing to us saying, you're doing this wrong or you're doing this right. They're policing us. They're saying, this is how things should be done. It's always an outside authority looking in and judging you. Whereas in the practice of witchcraft, we learn to experience the world from the inside out, from inside of our bodies and what we're feeling, what we're sensing. But this is very hard to do because there is a river, there is an ocean, there is this imperative that we constantly evaluate ourselves from the outside. And that's how ritual functions, to bring us back into our inner worlds, bring us back into our lived experience. And that's why we have to do it so regularly, because the push to see ourselves from an outside perspective and an outside view is so strong in our culture that we need practices to bring ourselves back in, to always be coming back into our bodies. So witches as enemies of the state goes all the way back to biblical times, when witches were referred to in the Bible, but they were referred to basically as that which stood outside of normal practice. So there wasn't necessarily practices that made you a witch, but what made you a witch was that you didn't do what the heterodox powers said that you should do. So witchcraft is the thing that we, the chosen tribe of God, ought not do. So witchcraft is defined as a negative quality, that which we do not do, rather than by a set of affirmative qualities like divining or passing your child through fire, or, you know, working with specific deities. Witchcraft is defined as the other. This person is Peter Gray, and he wrote a book called Apocalyptic Witchcraft. And in this book, he makes the argument that witchcraft is the work of the enemy. It's the sex that other people have, it's the drugs that other people take, it's the rite that other people perform. And it's impossible, it's the magic other people do. It's the clothes other people wear. It's the words that other people speak. It's the goddess that other people venerate. It's impossible to reach any other conclusion. For the whole of recorded history, witchcraft has been malefica, that is bad magic. Venefica, good magic. Incest, murder, we'll talk about that. They're accused of incest, accused of murder. They are in the next village, the next town, the next country. They are the old woman, the young woman, the Jew, the leper, the Cathar, the Templar, the Offite, the Bogomil. They do it, not us, you understand, them. You will find the witch at the end of a pointed finger. And in the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a book that was created by the church to be able to distinguish witches from the normal population, they defined witches as having three vital components. There were witches, there was the devil, and there was the will of God, and they always came together. The witch, as we have seen, is therefore the foreigner, more often than not the woman. And the devil is the double, whose worship is nocturnal, orgiastic, child-killing. The will of God is simply the power of the church and state to oppress, to accuse, and to enact the auto de fe. So Gray argues that, in fact, witchcraft as we understand it today was born of the rack. And that witches today should celebrate every form of emergent heresy. We must never forget our enemy, he argues. However peaceable we believe they are, they define us with violence.